Hello and welcome.
Hi,
Who just joined.
Okay, well, why don't we let people in and I'll go ahead and introduce you. So welcome everyone. I'm actually Michelle Hamilton. I'm the Director of Medieval Studies and also a member of a food group that we have, a Premodern Food Group here at the U, and we've done various activities. And this year, Sara has joined us. She's a PhD student in Spanish and Portuguese, but she has come to us after having done a Fulbright in Spain investigating Sephardic cuisine and working with food producers and scholars of food studies in Spain. And she is going to talk to us today about matzah. I'm going to do a little plug for this pizza hebraica, which we made in a different baking class that she's teaching, a Sephardic baking class. And this is really fantastic. It's really great. So I'm really excited about the matzah. Sara mentioned that she's recording this, and I just want to let people know that the center has a YouTube channel. I want to try to show that to you briefly, as I know people are still coming in, where we do have videos. So we have a couple other videos from events. And I hope you see this. This is from. Can you see my screen here?
No. Yet.
Sara, is that?
It's just, it says, oh.
Anyway, so we have, yeah, okay. You see it?
Yes.
Okay. So a couple weeks ago, Susan Barocas also spoke to us about the history of Sephardic cuisine, and that video is available for anyone who might be interested. And Carolyn Nadeau also spoke about Spanish food waste. And soon we'll have Sara's talk up there. So with that, I will stop sharing. And I know people are here to hear about matzah. So I'll let you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Michelle, for that great intro. And yes, we are here today to talk about matzah. And I'm very excited to be here with you all. So I'm just pinning sort of the different matzahs we will be interacting with or talking about over the course of the session. And I just want to say, I'm sorry in advance. I have to keep my window open because I don't have ventilation with my oven in my kitchen where I am. I'm currently in Massachusetts. So if it's a little loud and you hear a honk, I apologize in advance, but I need to keep the window open because we'll be working with a really hot oven. And this is one of those things that you can also, you're welcome to cook along with me if you've prepped for that on the event poster. I did include an ingredient list and a utensil list, and it's really all you really need to do this workshop is just some flour, some water, a bowl, and an oven. So if you want to take a moment now and get those things, or just feel free to watch along and then experiment later, that's also great. So this will be a real kind of mix of the technical aspects of matzah and the culinary aspects. We're really going to actually be diving into the making of it by hand. So just to begin, I want to say that matzah is an unleavened bread. For those of you who may not know, I'm sure many of you who are here have some experience with matzah or have, at least heard of it. But it is kind of this very symbolic bread of the Jewish tradition. And outside of the Jewish community, it's not necessarily something that people know. But it's one of those things that even though it is so important to the Jewish tradition, it's something that everyone can enjoy. And so if you are not of the Jewish tradition or the Jewish community, I also invite you to, try making it as well and having fun with it and playing with the flavors here, either as like an intellectual exercise or a culinary exercise, because I think the technique of it is also informative. So that's just a secondary disclaimer ahead of this class. And so just to introduce it, so the actual baking time of this is going to be short, right? Because ritualistically and halachically, that meaning legalistically in the Jewish tradition, the making of matzah, from when the water hits the flour that is being used for the matzah to when it's baked and fully done, it should take no more than 18 minutes. So really, the cooking is going to be kind of short. So I just want to give some historical and cultural context to this bread before we begin. And so the main kind of header statement of this talk is that matzah is a symbolic food that's shared across the Jewish diaspora, across Jewish communities. And it's different than a lot of other foods, you know, like that beautiful pizza hebraica that Michelle shared, where you have the Jewish community dispersed in one of the farthest reaching diasporas across the entire world by the year 70 AD. And with that, all of these Jewish communities globally are integrating different flavors. They're taking from different culinary repertoires. They're creating new dishes and in a way gastronomically expressing what it is to be Jewish in very individual and specific ways to their individual trajectories. But every Jewish community eats matzah. And it's one of the few foods that sort of can singularly be identified as Jewish and is also shared across all of these Jewish communities. So it's special, I think, on a cultural level as well as a ritualistic and religious level. And so I just wanted to highlight that, because what we're dealing with here is not only like a fun culinary experiment and important holiday food, it's also something that is sort of unique in the way that it is a thread that connects global Jewish communities in a way that many other foods do not. Okay, so that being said, what we're going to be making today, we'll be making Ashkenazi Eastern European flat matzah. So that's what you see here, and I'm actually going to just crack one open so you can hear it. So it's thin, and it's sort of like, it's more cracker-like, and it's going to be harder and crunchier. And then we're going to make Sephardic Matzah, which is not a cracker-like consistency. It's more like a flatbread, and it's foldable and malleable. And so we're going to kind of talk about the differences between how those two came to be. I also have here, at the end of this, we'll be talking about some fun ways if you just have store-bought matzah. This is just store-bought matzah. I did not get it into this perfect square shape. That would have been incredibly impressive. But this is a machine-made matzah that you can easily find in your supermarket. So at the end of this, besides teaching you how to make this thin matzah and this thicker matzah, I'm also going to be showing you some fun ways to actually jazz up your matzah as is, borrowing flavors and ideas from across global Jewish communities. So I think it'll be fun. Yeah.
Can I just interrupt?
Yeah.
Your camera is such that we can see you, but I could not see the matzah that you were showing.
If you go on to speaker view, excuse me.
I did go on to speaker view.
It should be pinned so that you can see it.
Okay, well, I just wanted to let you know that I didn't just so.
Okay.
Where.
So
I saw the bare top.
Okay, that's interesting. I'm seeing a different view. Is anyone else having trouble seeing the matzah?
I can see it.
Okay.
I can see it, but I had to go up to the picture of it and pin it.
Okay, so I think if everyone can go to their speaker view, the matzah should be pinned for you. I will also pin myself, and maybe that way.
Okay, thank you.
That way, can you see two screens with me and the matzah?
I can see you up as a little person, like a little screen, and the big screen is the matzah.
Okay, great. That's ideal. That's what we're going for. Okay, so I'll maintain these pins so you can see what I'm doing, because this camera where you see my hands, that's going to be where I'm demoing, and then you'll be able to see me talking.
Thank you to the person who explained about pinning that. Now I can see.
Great. Thanks, Leslie. And thank you for the tech help. Great. Okay. So now let's talk a little bit about the history of matzah, or really the religious history of matzah. So like I said, again, matzah is this critical bread in the Jewish tradition. It is one of the three elements of the Passover Seder, Seder meaning order and Passover being the holiday. over the holiday of Passover, it's traditional to have a ritual meal in which we retell the story of the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt using different symbolic foods on a Seder plate, and going through a very kind of ritualized, ordered retelling that incorporates culinary elements. So from a food studies perspective, the Passover Seder is really fascinating because it is this incredible Jewish tradition that tells the story of this fundamental story of Jewish identity from a gastronomic perspective. Food is a really key aspect of the storytelling here. And three of the elements that are essential according to the ancient rabbis, the sages who wrote the Talmud, a commentary text that complements the Torah, which is also known as the Hebrew Bible, or some people refer to it as the Old Testament. The three main elements of the Passover Seder are matzah, the paschal lamb bone, which is symbolic of the Israelites painting their houses with the blood of a paschal lamb, and maror, or a bitter herb. So without those three elements, you do not have a Passover Seder. And so matzah is one of those three, and without it, you can't technically have your Passover meal. So for millennia, matzah was made by hand in communal ovens. It was actually a well-known bread of nomads. It wasn't anything sort of novel to the ancient Israelites who made it and incorporated it in the Seder, nor was it anything strange to the different communities of people, religious and ethnic groups that were contemporary to the Israelites. It was actually a very common thing that people would make and then take with them on long journeys because of its keeping power. It only has, ideally 2 ingredients, flour and water. And you bake it so that you get rid of all excess water. So just from that perspective, matzah wasn't anything really out of the ordinary, but then it becomes this really important symbol of Jewish ritualistic identity by its incorporation in the Passover Seder. And so then over time, as Jewish communities leave Israel, as they spread out across the world, as new breads and new ways of baking come into the Jewish culinary repertoire, matzah sort of becomes reserved to the space of Passover. Okay, so with that, I'm actually going to take us over now to start baking, and I will share some more history as we go, but I want us to get baking. My oven is currently set to 475 degrees. So if you're baking along with me, I don't know how many people are baking along with me, but if you are, feel free to set your oven to 475 degrees. We'll also be cooking matzah on the stovetop. There are 2 techniques here: baked for our thin Ashkenazi style matzah, and then stovetop for our soft Sephardic matzah. So with that, I'm just going to take you over. Excuse the screen over here. And then I'm going to bring you here. Just going to do some adjustment. Always an interesting cinematographic experience here. Okay, so great. So let me angle this so you can really see. So we're gonna start off with our Ashkenazi style matzah. And as I say, Ashkenazi Jews are those Jews who hail from Germany and Eastern Europe. The term originally applied to a small community of people who were actually from Ashkenaz, which is a territory along the Rhine Valley, and it's sort of between northern France and Germany, I believe. Sorry, I'm having some issues with my camera. And it originally applied only to those Jews coming from that area, but it has since expanded to include all those Jews of Eastern European heritage. So again, I'm sorry, I'm having some camera difficulties. Let's prop it up here. Hopefully it will stay for us. Great. And so now this is going to be more similar to that machine rolled matzah. It's going to be thinner. In the Ashkenazi tradition, matzah became something that was supposed to be thin and cracker-like. I haven't exactly found the reason why yet, but I think it's interesting because visually it's very different than the Sephardic matzah that we'll be making later. So I'm adapting a recipe actually that comes from a really wonderful cookbook on Ashkenazi Jewish food called the Gefilte Manifesto. And basically it's about the reclaiming of Ashkenazi flavors as delicious, since many of us know it sort of in its most Passover iteration as gefilte fish. But this is a really wonderful recipe, and it's modeled on the recipes of the cookbook author's grandmothers. And in this recipe, they use, so I'm just measuring out a cup of flour here. Okay, so as I was saying, this is a very basic recipe. So the key components of matzah should really only be flour and water. But of course, throughout time, various Jewish communities have added their different flavors, even just a little bit of salt to add some sort of culinary interest to this matzah. And also a sort of unique aspect of this particular matzah, which is of the Ashkenazi tradition, as I said, is it uses different flours, specifically rye flour, which is pretty characteristic of Eastern European baking generally. But in this case, it adds a really interesting texture and taste to the matzah that would not be there otherwise. And so this is totally acceptable to substitute different flours. I'm actually going to be using buckwheat flour, which is another sort of traditional flour type from Eastern Europe. It's made of buckwheat groats, or kasha, for those of you who know what kasha is. And this is actually gluten-free. So you could make a full matzah completely gluten-free with buckwheat flour, and it would be delicious. But what's cool about it is it will add a different color and a different flavor to this matzah. And we're only going to add water and salt to it besides this, which will be different than the other matzah recipe we're going to be working with later, which has oil, and like you have the options there of adding different flavorings as well. So I'm just scooping a half a cup of buckwheat flour in here, and you can see, I think, here, I'll hold it up to the camera. You can see the color difference between the all-purpose flour here and the buckwheat flour. And, you know, if you don't have buckwheat flour, if it's not something you want to use, if you don't have rye flour, you can also just completely do just all-purpose flour or bread flour and buckwheat flour. So we're going to mix that together. I am going to add a pinch of salt. And so the rabbis, the commentators on the Torah, basically, after much debate, as the ancient rabbis are wont to do, just determined that matzah to be officially kosher, ritualistically pure, decided that matzah should only be made with flour and water. It should not have any spices. Like I said, it should not have any salt. But here, because, you know, for example, I'm not working in a kosher kitchen. For centuries, many Jewish families did not necessarily have, you know, someone guarding their kitchens to make sure that every aspect of this process was kosher. They also added salt. They also added spices. There were kind of individual improvisations here. And I should say here also, and I'm prolonging when I'm actually putting the water into this mixture, because once I, like I said, put water into this mixture of flour, then it should only take me 18 minutes for the mixing, the forming, and the baking total for it to be technically kosher matzah, which again, I'm contradicting myself, but it's kind of this complicated dance of adhering to certain strictures that count as matzah to some rabbis and not adhering to some, which for more Orthodox rabbis make it count as kosher. So again, just to add here, there's another genre of matzah called shmora matzah. Shmora comes from the Hebrew verb shomer, which means guarded. And in that process of matzah making, every single aspect of the matzah making process, including the growth and the milling of the wheat that's used for the matzah, is watched over by a rabbi who certifies it as guarded and kosher, and then also repeats the blessing for the mitzvah, which is L'Shem Mitzvah Matzah. So to the name of the commandment to make matzah. And so for those of you who may have had experience with shmora matzah, it's usually a much rounder and softer matzah. It sort of has a cardboard-like consistency almost than the flat square matzahs that you can buy in the boxes. And shmora means that at every step of the 11th step matzah making process, there has been someone there to watch it, to guard it, and to say this blessing, which is important. Great. So now what we're going to do, I'm going to add a half a cup of warm water here, a half a cup, 2 tablespoons to be exact. And this difference between the temperatures is also, it seems minimal, but is important. Because in the other recipe we are working with, we're using cold water. Okay, so I'm actually going to ask someone here, would somebody be my 18-minute timer? Anybody willing? Okay, Michelle Sharp, you're my 18-minute timer. Okay, so as soon as I put in this water, I need you to keep track of the 18 minutes that pass to make sure that we're forming it and baking it fully. Okay, cool. So in goes our half cup of water. And then I'm gonna add 2 tablespoons. And I'm actually the best tool to do this is I'm actually gonna mix it with a fork. So nobody really knows where the 18-minute stricture comes from, 18 minutes. The number 18 is significant in the Jewish tradition. It's an important number because 18 stands for chai, which means life. It's the chet and the yud come together to numerically form the word for life. And so the number 18 is highly esteemed in the Jewish tradition. And so it makes sense in a certain way that 18 should have been the number that was fixed upon here, but there's very little explaining exactly how that came to be. And in some Sephardic communities, actually, there's no time adherence really kept to. It's really for each individual matzah, as quickly as possible. So for a lot of people who still make their matzot at home, they don't necessarily adhere to that 18-minute stricture. But this is one of those places where we see kind of the again, halachic, meaning legalistic in terms of legal observation of Jewish law and interpretation of Jewish law. It's sort of like Jewish jurisprudence. The differences between the Ashkenazi tradition, those of Eastern Europe, and the Sephardic tradition, which in this case means everyone who's not Ashkenazi. So I'm briefly kneading this. I'm just going to pause myself here momentarily from this explanation to show you that I'm just kneading this with my hands very quickly. And then I'm going to take a bench scraper, but you can also use a sharp knife. And I'm going to divide this into 4 equal pieces. It should be kind of wet. It's going to be a little sticky, and just roll it in the flour into a ball. And I like to knead it just a little bit more because I find that it works better. And so I'm gonna flatten it down onto the surface and well flour my rolling pin. And now I'm gonna roll this out into a long ovular shape. Really, you can do any shape. The square shape only just comes out of the industrial process that was used to shape matzot. So square matzahs are actually an advent of, you know, the late 20th or the late 19th into the 20th century. So here we are. And then I'm just going to take a fork and perforate this matzah all over to prevent bubbles from forming. Because if bubbles form that are larger than the size of a hazelnut, according to the rabbinic authority, it doesn't count as matzah. So I'm just going to put this to the side, and I'm going to form all of these. Michelle, how am I doing on time?
You are at 3.5 minutes.
Into it?
Yes.
Okay, great. Right, so we see here, it's actually a very quick process, but if you expand this out to the scale of you know, thousands of matzah, and I'm going to share actually the recipe sheet. I forgot to do that. I have a recipe sheet for you all to make your own matzot. On that recipe sheet, there's actually a video from the Sephardic community of England, excuse me. And they still hand make matzah, and it's actually quite impressive. It's, you know, about 20 men of the community. I think it's a Northern English Sephardic community. They hand make all of their matzah still, and they make sure that every single matzah that's mixed is made in under 18 minutes. It's quite impressive. And of course, like that 18-minute mark becomes less of a hassle once industrialized matzah making starts. And so that starts in the late 18th or 19th century, excuse me. And that is mostly brought by Ashkenazi Jewish immigrants to America. One in particular, a man named Dov Ber, who immigrated from Lithuania to Germany, and then to America, who later became known by the name of Manischewitz. He, with a friend of his who was a rabbi, started a matzah bakery, and they became so successful that they had to buy machines which had been patented in the 18th century by another Jewish man named Isaac Singer from Austria. And they started mass making matzot. And now Manischewitz, through like the different conglomerations and corporate acquisitions, makes about 50% of all matzah created and consumed in the United States. So it's just an interesting fact. So
Sarah, quick question.
Yes.
I was wondering, so thinking how many rules there are, has matzah been traditionally more of a female versus a male task, or obviously Manischewitz being male, but
yeah, totally. Well, so that's a really great question. Traditionally, it was women who handmade matzot. You know, and there's sort of a distinction that's made between hand matzah and machine matzah. Like right now, we're making hand matzah, and hand matzah was traditionally, you know, as I'm sure you surmise very well, like was made generally by women. Machine matzah, once it was industrialized, was sort of stewarded from a high level by men, like Manischewitz, for example. But a lot of the people who actually worked on the line were women as well, especially in early 20th century America. So it's just interesting, you know, another example of the ways that like female labor in the medieval age and then onward and traditionally is then converted to male labor in an industrialized context. So now I'm just going to pause myself, and I'm going to put all of these matzot into my oven. I have 2 baking pans in there, and I'm just going to throw these on those baking pans. And I'm just going to bring you over here to see them. You can see the matzo on the pan. I'm going to straighten those out. And we're gonna bake these at 475 degrees for 3 minutes, and then we're gonna flip them. Michelle, how are we doing on time?
8 minutes elapsed.
Okay, awesome. So we'll be well on our way to matzah way before the time elapses. And so to that question of female labor, again, it depends on the community also, I do have to say. Now, because of the strictures, especially in the Ashkenazi community, because over time, especially over the 19th and 20th centuries, Ashkenazi observance of Passover mitzvot and halacha became much stricter than in Sephardic communities. And that just has to do with, you know, the development of the Jewish tradition and the religious tradition in those areas over time. But when we look at the halachic rulings of rabbis in the Ashkenazi community versus Sephardic community, there is this real concern of people's ability to fully preserve the laws of Passover and laws generally. And so even now, there's a very kind of clear division between Ashkenazi observance of Passover, in which you don't eat kitniot, meaning legumes. There can be no trace of chametz, which is leavening, or seor, which is sort of like starters. And so like, you know, sourdough starter, which many people have. This was an important ingredient in breads for so long. And in many Jewish communities, actually, what Passover is not putting any starter in your bread and then refreshing your starter. You throw out the starter that has accumulated from the year before, and you start fresh after the Passover holiday. And so there was such concern on the part of these Ashkenazi rabbis that, you know, somewhere along the line, either in for example, in the process of making matzah, that it's from the Ashkenazi side of things where the idea of shmura matzah comes in, that somewhere along the process of milling, of separating, of drying the grain, of creating the matzah, there could be some accidental chametz or slippage. Someone who's not Jewish might be involved in that process. And it concerned them on the level of observance, given the fact that if one does not fully observe these laws, they will be sort of excised. The word they use is excised, not in a literal way from the community, but in a sort of afterlife sense, that in the sense of your afterlife, you will not arrive to, you know, the goodness of the afterlife, or if the Messiah comes, you will not take part in resurrection. So from that side, it's just kind of interesting how these two traditions break off, and one becomes very stringent in certain ways and the other does not. And so I'm just going to pause here because I see some comments in the chat. Robin, you have Manischewitz matzah meal, yes. And so, you know, Manischewitz becomes one of the main brands with which American Jewry identifies matzah, you know, from the 20th century onward. Which I think is kind of, it's an amazing immigrant story. On the other side of things, we have the Sephardic tradition. And so in this case, when I'm talking about the Ashkenazi and Sephardic tradition, I'm talking about, by saying Sephardic, I'm talking about sort of everyone who's not of Eastern European descent, culture, or observance, which is different than how I would normally talk about Sephardic Jewry, because for me, I study the culinary heritage and cultural identity of Sephardic Jews, specifically those Jews who trace their roots back to Spain.
Sarah, you're at 12 minutes.
I'm at 12 minutes. That's good. Thanks, Michelle. No, that's great. Well, let's check on our matzo. So, okay. So, I don't know if you can see that. I'm going to try and, there you go. Okay. So I'm actually going to take the spatula and just flip these. And you see they're already much flatter. And so we're going to give them 2 more minutes, and then we will take those out of the oven. And those will be our matzah. Great. So we see it's actually not that hard to make these matzah in 18 minutes. And Sharon, I'm using a mixture of all-purpose flour and buckwheat flour, but you can also use rye. Rye is great. You can also use whole wheat flour. It's also excellent. And this is where, especially when we get to the part about uses for matzah after Passover, or, you know, as a fun thing during the Passover holiday, well, this is a fun way to introduce flavor. And so the ratio is 1 cup of all-purpose flour to a 1/2 cup of whatever other flour you're using. The total amount of the dry ingredients is 1.5 cups. So great.
Excuse me?
Yeah.
Excuse me, may I ask you something? Before you put the matzahs on the oven sheet, do you have to flour the oven sheets, or just directly, and you need to preheat those also?
Yes, so it's just directly. I thank you for that question. I didn't mention that, so my apologies. The oven sheets should be in the oven, heating up with the oven ahead of when you put it in. You don't need oil. You don't need flour. There's nothing. You can also, I've seen various recipes. There are different vessels you can use for this. A cast iron is great because it will heat, sort of similar for the way you cook sourdough bread. It also works really well for matzah, especially if you have like a griddle. Another thing, some people actually buy ceramic tiles and lay ceramic tiles in their oven to heat up, and the heat from the ceramic tile is like a clay oven. Another way of doing it is you can actually use a pizza stone and just heat up a pizza stone and put these on.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for the question. And I appreciate anyone shouting out questions. I can't see you all, so I'm just gonna pause here and ask if anybody else has questions before we move on to Sephardic Matzah. Okay, cool. It seems good. I'm actually gonna see, Michelle, were those 2 minutes up? Did they pass?
I think so. We're at 15.5 minutes total. Yes. So I think sorry, your 2 have passed.
No, that's okay. Can you tell me when it hits 16?
Yes.
Great. So when it hits 16, it'll be out. So we see it's actually, it feels like very quick, but it's actually just a good enough amount of time. Okay, so on the other end of the spectrum of matzah qualities, we have Sephardic matzah. And like I said, usually when I say Sephardic, I'm referring to those Jews who connect their heritage in some way to Spain and Portugal, to the Iberian Peninsula.
You're at 16.
Okay, here we are. So I'm going to pause myself again, and I'm going to turn you back with me to see the oven. And let's see how our... So at this point, they should be fully dried out. That's what we're going for. We're going for a matzah that is completely dry. If there's any sort of leftover moisture, and we know it's dry when it's not bendy. So actually, these could use a couple more minutes. So I'm going to just throw them in for, our remaining minute. So again, that word that I keep saying, halachically, legalistically, by Jewish jurisprudence, they should be dry and cracker-like, because if there's any remaining moisture, it makes them unkosher from a rabbinic standpoint. Okay, so returning to the point of Sephardic Jews, here when I say Sephardic, I'm breaking my normal tradition, and I'm saying I'm including all Jewish groups that are not Ashkenazi, that do not follow Ashkenazi liturgy or ritual observance. The ritual observance is mostly shared, but slightly different. And matzah is one of the ways that we can see how they differ. Because whereas for Ashkenazi matzah, there cannot be any moisture in this dough, for Sephardic matzah, there will be a lot of moisture and it will be more like a wrap, but it will also conversely be more aligned with, original matzot that Jews have been making for millennia. So I'm going to put in 2/3 of a cup of flour here. And I'm using all-purpose flour. You can mix half and half whole wheat and all-purpose flour in this if you want.
There, we're just about to hit 18.
Okay, and then we're taking it out of the oven. And they should be good. So here we are. Here's our matzah. This guy got a little folded over, but we can see just right here. That's nice and crispy and crackly, and very hot. So there we have it, our matzah. I'm gonna put these on a rack to cool, and they should dry out further. But we have, within 18 minutes, we have our matzah. So thank you, Michelle, for being my timekeeper. Great. Cool. So now we are going, and actually, before I do this, I'm just gonna share with you the recipe sheet for this class so that you can make your own matzah. So you'll just find it in the chat. The file was just sent. Great. Okay. Great. So now we are going to add our water. And here we're going to use 2 ounces of water. We're going to use a 1/4 cup of water, and here it's cold. And so some of these observances actually come from the desire to avoid the formation of gluten. Even though you need it, you're trying to avoid any sort of leavening agent from getting into this dough, because then it would be deemed ritualistically unacceptable. So it's interesting that the Ashkenazi matzah uses warm water, because warm water tends to increase the proliferation of natural yeast. But because it goes so quickly, like, we're not actually allowing for any natural yeast to form. But to this water and to this, again, we're gonna add a pinch of salt to the flour. And to this water, we're actually gonna add 2 teaspoons of vegetable oil. And what's interesting here in the Sephardic tradition is that in the Sephardic tradition, kind of generally, and by Sephardic, I'm including Mizrahi Jewish culture, which comes from the Middle East and the Levant. I'm including Ethiopian Jewish culture. I'm including every Jew who traces their heritage back to somewhere that is not Eastern Europe again. In all of these matzah recipes, there are different ways of, adding flavor and adding texture and adding color. And so I was actually reading about a matzah recipe the other day that was inherited by a Sephardic family whose roots go back to Andalusia, and they left Andalusia in about 1485 and then moved to Morocco, and their family's been in Morocco since 1485. And so now they're based in Tetuan, and it was the story of this man who was trying to keep alive his family's heritage by writing down and recooking all of his mother's Passover recipes. And her Passover recipes actually include a recipe for matzah, a soft matzah like this, that has orange blossom water in it. So like I have, some orange blossom oil. I couldn't find my orange blossom water, but if you want a different flavoring, in the eyes of the Sephardic tradition especially, that was totally fine. We also see records from the Inquisition in Spain in the late 16th and into the late 15th into the 16th centuries, you see all of these people who are taken in for Judaizing, for being, for overtly practicing Catholicism, but secretly still practicing Judaism. And their records of their confessions to the inquisitorial committee who was questioning them for this behavior, they read like recipes for all of these different dishes, but especially matzah. And a very common recipe actually was to include honey, olive oil, and pepper in your matzah. And actually a modern matzah making company based in Portland is making this matzah recipe as a sort of like artisanal matzah recipe. Yeah, and it's so delicious. It's honestly great. And so there's the question of whether this technically adheres to Jewish law, but really throughout time, people, specifically women, to the question that was asked before, have been making these recipes and have been adding their own kind of special flavorings to it. Yeah, so it's honey and pepper and olive oil. So I'm using vegetable oil for this, which is a neutral oil. You could also use sunflower oil. And actually, as I'm thinking of it, we're gonna heat up our stove. I've got a cast iron pan on my stove right now. And I'm heating up my cast iron pan. And so yeah, so these are different ways to interpret these recipes that people have been doing for years. And actually crypto-Jewish communities, those communities who were forcibly or voluntarily converted to Catholicism at various periods in Spanish history, one of the main kind of lingering observances that connected them to their Jewish faith, whether they knew it or not, was the preparation of matzah. And so there's a really grand proliferation of all of these matzah or matzah-like recipes. Sometimes they're called pan de Pascua, Easter bread, or tortas, cakes. That's a good question, Richard. I'm forgetting the name of the Portland company, but I will find it and share it with everyone so they can buy that matzah. But so there's this proliferation of crypto-Jewish matzah recipes, and sometimes they even have egg in them, sugar, honey, all of these things that technically by Jewish law would render them not kosher, not ritualistically pure. But it's a really kind of, I think, I read it as a very wonderful story of resilience and secret observance that is mainly led by women and invites a certain level of ritualistic improvisation that allows these things to stay alive. So that's just a small side note about that. So anyway, back to our Sephardic matzah. So this is going to make one matzah. So we're definitely going to be within the time frame of our 18 minutes again here. But just in case, Michelle, will you time me again? Maybe.
Oops. Yes. Okay, ready, set.
Ready, go. Okay. Great. So, and I actually forgot our oil here. So we're going to put in our oil. And so here you can substitute olive oil. That would be great. You can also use, in the Ethiopian community, they actually use black sesame oil, which has a really interesting flavor. So that would be good here. So I'm just mixing this again, and we're seeing how quickly this all comes together. I'm using a fork. Again, a fork I find is one of the best tools for this. And then I'm just going to take my hand and try and get all the dry bits that are in this bowl and incorporate it into this ball of dough.
Sarah?
Yes.
In the recipe that you just sent us, it says to add 2 teaspoons of black sesame oil, and then it also says to add 1 tablespoon of black sesame oil.
So the 1 tablespoon is actually for your pan. I'm sorry if that's not clear.
Oh, okay.
2 teaspoons go in your dough, and then the 1 tablespoon will go on your pan. So,
Okay, thanks
yeah.
for
No, that's a good question. And actually, speaking of, I'm going to take a little bit of oil and actually oil my hand to shape this. And here you're just going to put this ball of dough in the palm of your hand, and we're going to press it out with the heel of our other hand, sort of twisting it as we go. And again, I've been heating up my cast iron pan, so that's where we're going to cook this. And I will bring you over with me to show you before I put this in the pan. And this is a much more kind of malleable dough, and it's much more like a flatbread than the cracker-like consistency of the Ashkenazi dough. So now here we have our flattened disc. It's about 4 or 5 inches across. I'm going to take you with me over here so you can see the pan. And so this is my cast iron that I've been heating. I'm going to turn you so you can see me. So I've been heating this pan, and now I'm actually going to put it in here. I'm going to take my fork, and I'm also going to have a bowl of water on the side as I shape this. Okay. I have my bowl of water on the side. I'm going to put this, and you can oil your pan. I'm not going to oil my pan because this cast iron is seasoned, so I do not need to oil it. If you want to, you can oil it. It adds another level of flavor. So I'm going to throw this into my pan, and I'm going to dip my hands in cold water, and I'm actually just going to squeeze the dough out and sort of form it into a larger flatbread on this hot surface. Being careful not, of course, not to burn myself. That's why we coat our fingers in cold water. And the recipe says, to the width of the pan, it depends on how thick you want your matzah. Actually, in the Sephardic tradition, they say that, it can be up to 4 hand breadths of thickness. So it can be very thick in the Sephardic tradition, and that's okay. I like it about this size. This is maybe like 6 inches across in diameter. And then I'm going to take my fork and I'm going to dip it in water, and then I'm going to press out a pattern onto the surface of my matzah, just to give it some textural interest, which is different than how we, punctured it with a fork. So really, again, here, this is what's wonderful about Sephardic matzah is it allows for, I'm back here, so you can't really see. It allows for some really wonderful improvisation of recipes. So I'm actually gonna put you over here. So you can really play with the structure of the matzah that you're making. And so we're gonna leave it here for about 3 minutes until it blackens. We want a sort of blackened bottom. And actually, while we do that, I'm going to make another one so you can see the process again. And so, in certain communities, back to that question about, who was doing this, it was women. And in a lot of Sephardic communities, in fact, in like the Yemenite community, the Jewish community of Yemen, for example, throughout the holiday of Passover, because these soft Sephardic matzot don't keep in the same way as the flat Ashkenazi matzot, they would make new matzot every day, matzot being the plural of matzah. So, it's this interesting question between, strict Passover observance and the sort of culinary delight that actually matzah, which is technically the bread of affliction, can have. Going back actually to the point about the bread of affliction and to crypto-Jewish Passover observance. And actually, I'm going to pause myself so that we can flip this matzah and see. So we're going to see what it looks like. So it's still a little light. Maybe I'd give it a few more minutes. So I'm going to actually turn up the heat on this pan. You want it to be very hot. In some Sephardic communities, they actually use a tandoor, sort of like a tandoori oven. If you've been to an Indian restaurant, it's this conical clay oven that gets extremely hot. It can get up to like 1,000 degrees actually. And in communities that have that sort of oven, the matzot are actually stuck to the wall that oven, similar to naan. It's a very similar process as naan. And then to the point of bread of affliction, right? So in the crypto-Jewish tradition, which I find very fascinating, matzah becomes this real marker of continued adherence to Jewish ritual and to Jewish identity. And actually, it comes out, especially as we get later and crypto-Jewish families get farther from normative Jewish experience after the expulsion of the Jewish community from Spain, they actually start adding things like dirt to their matzah recipes, because dirt was seen as a way to really feel afflicted when you ate this bread. It was a type of penance, because in the crypto-Jewish community, people felt that because they had overtly converted to Catholicism, there was this sort of strange feeling of guilt that remained. And so to that point, they would add dirt to their dough to really, afflict themselves. And matzah actually becomes so important that most crypto-Jewish families don't just eat it on Passover, they also eat it around the time of Rosh Hashanah, around the time of Yom Kippur. It becomes this really portable and resilient form of Jewish practice, gastronomic Jewish practice throughout the ages. So it's just very fascinating how this bread, which is fundamental in many ways and is one of the sort of soul foods that truly marks Jewish identity, becomes so wrapped up even in the secret observance of Judaism. To the point where even some crypto-Jews, because the Eucharist sort of looked similar to them as matzah, they start to actively disdain the Eucharist, but hail matzah as this really critical thing. So it's all just very interesting. So we're gonna check on this matzah again, and let's see. There we go. We start seeing the brown spots. That's really what we're going for with our matzah. So I'm just gonna flip it back. Michelle, what's our time at?
8.5 minutes elapsed.
Okay, great. So I mean, we're doing well on time with this matzah. It's 18 minutes is a lot for this particular type of matzah. You only really need 5 minutes on that first side and then 3 minutes on the second side. So I'm making another batch here. I've put in my 2/3 of a cup of flour and my pinch of salt. And again, if you're following the crypto-Jewish observance, you can play here. So, you can add some eggs and make a sort of biscuit-like dough. You can add spices. Like I have a bunch of spices here that we'll use after, that I will show you how to jazz up your normal matzah with a little bit. It's great to play. So I'm gonna add our water and our oil again, and mixing it with our fork. Sometimes the dough is a lot more wet than you would like, and that's when we just kind of add some more flour. You want kind of a stiff dough with matzah. The less water, the better, because it means that later on, when you are storing it, it will last for longer. It will also halachically be considered ritualistically kosher. So I'm just adding some flour to that, and then I'm going to take a little bit of oil. I'm going to oil my hands again, and I'm just going to press it out. And as I press it out, I'm actually going to come over here again and check on this. Just check it. It's nice and dark. And so we're done with that matzah. And we can put our new matzah on the pan. And again, take water and just press it out. I'm lightly pressing. I'm not pressing enough to even contact the pan. And you can press it out into a vaguely round shape, and that's great. It doesn't have to be very big. If you're using something like a steel skillet, or don't use nonstick for this. Nonstick, it will burn on you and it won't be fun. And it can't get to the necessary heat that you need for something like this, I highly recommend cast iron or steel. If you're using steel, you might actually want to brush it again with a little sesame oil, a little vegetable oil. You can use olive oil too. Olive oil has a lower smoke point than other oils, which means the smoke point is the temperature at which the fat smokes, which means it can't sustain a hot temperature. And so because this is a very quick and ideally hot process, you want an oil that really can withstand a high temperature for smoking. So that's a vegetable oil, a canola oil. If you can find sunflower oil, that's been very traditional throughout Sephardic communities for a long time. And that's a great oil to use here. Sesame oil also tends to have a higher smoke point than something like olive oil. That being said, you can put the olive oil in your mixture to have that sort of delicious crypto-Jewish experience.
Excuse me, Sarah, may I ask another question? Sorry for interrupting you.
I love questions.
Could I use grape oil also for the Sephardic one?
Yes, grapeseed oil would be great. It wouldn't necessarily be like traditionally Sephardic, but that's okay, because some of what I want to encourage you all to do through this cooking demo is have a little fun with your own matzah recipe and find your own kind of matzah observance. So grapeseed oil is great. It's also, that has a very high smoke point. Avocado seed oil, also great. So there are a bunch of different ones. I could imagine even using different oils that come from nuts, like walnuts or hazelnuts, would impart an interesting flavor. And if you want to impart the flavor, but you don't want to cook with it, use like a lower smoke point oil, like olive oil in the dough, but not when you're cooking it.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I appreciate it. So I see my matzah smoking. And I didn't make the fork marks on this one, but I'm going to flip it and see how it's doing. So yeah, see, we got that nice sort of brown aspect, which is exactly what we want. And those don't take the full 18 minutes, which is great, because it's very quick. And, you know, in the communities where these things were made by hand, not only before the week, but, you know, as the week went, it just ensures that you have a really delicious piece of matzah that you can actually enjoy, even though, you know, in the ideal religious observance, it's a bread of affliction. But, you know, there's enjoyment too. And that's sort of from the theological perspective of Passover, I think that's a very important lesson. Passover holds a lot of contradictions in it as a holiday. It holds the sweetness of liberation with the bitterness of slavery. And so, you know, similarly, matzah may be the bread of affliction, but it can also be this really great vehicle for a lot of delicious experiences over the course of the Passover holiday. So with that, I also saw a question in the chat. Yes, and you can use orange blossom water for flavor in the dough as well. Or, you know, I think you could play also like rose water. I mean, for orange blossom water, I'm not going to quote you a specific quantity because that's to taste. And it can, if you put too much, it can end up tasting a little soapy. So I would recommend starting teaspoon by teaspoon. So just start with a teaspoon and add to your taste as you go. And what's great about this recipe is as you're forming it one by one, so you can actually taste them. So I see my pan smoking here again, and I'm just gonna check on this other side, and here we go, and then that's our matzah, and it's done. So we've got this nice kind of collection right here of matzot. We've got our Ashkenazi matzot on the right and Sephardic matzot on the left. And now actually I'm gonna just really quick trick of things that I do for my own matzah that is just store-bought during Passover to, you know, keep things interesting, because from a culinary standpoint, you know, Passover demands you to be a very creative chef. And I'm going to bring over our store-bought matzah. I just bought, you know, whole wheat matzah that was on sale at the supermarket. It's Straits, but, you know, equally you could get Manischewitz. My family's personal brand of choice for matzah is Aviv. you know, everybody has their preference. And so this is honestly a very, very simple trick, but it's very delicious. My oven is currently heated to 350 degrees. If you're cooking your matzot right now, you can just keep it at 475 if you like. And I'm going to take some olive oil and put it in a bowl. And then I'm going to create a sort of spice paste that I'm then going to spread on these matzah sheets, and we're going to bake them. And then all of a sudden we have like a delicious crisp, or it can become a topping for something like a mina de matzah, which is a matzah spanakopita that is very often made in the Sephardic Jewish community. You layer sheets of matzah with cooked spinach and egg, and it's delicious. And so I'm gonna just add a few spices, and here we can really play, you know, with all of those different flavor profiles that I mentioned, you know, from the Sephardic tradition. So I'm gonna add some cayenne pepper here for some spice. You could also do some actual pepper, some black pepper. I'm gonna add a little honey that I've been heating, and so it's more liquid. Just gonna add the honey in there, and then, you know, a nice pinch of salt right here. Salt. And I'm just gonna stir it with a pastry brush. And what's great about this is you add like this beautiful color element, and this is something that if you are Jewish, if Passover observance is your holiday observance, you can actually, you know, incorporate these into the matzot that you're eating in the ritual meal of the Seder. Or they're just really delicious ways of eating matzah throughout the week of Passover, since it is a holiday that lasts a week. So I've just kind of painted my sheet of matzah with all of these delicious herbs and spices, and I'm gonna throw them on a baking sheet and bake it for about 2 to 3 minutes, and then there'll be delicious kind of chips or a vehicle for an interesting Hillel sandwich, right? Hillel sandwich being haroset, the apple and nut mixture, or the date paste, and maror being the bitter herb. Often it's horseradish or another sort of bitter taste. And the Hillel sandwich is the combination of 3 of the main aspects of the Passover Seder meal. So it could be that. But so I'm going to just prepare a couple of those. And while I'm preparing them, you know, we have 19 minutes left. I'd love to hear your questions, or if you missed anything, or if you want me to make another thing of matzah, because we have a full 18 minutes, you know, so we could. So I'll be here. Does anybody have any questions or anything that I missed that they'd like to?
Sara, sorry, I'm asking a lot of questions today, but could you please repeat the amount of ingredients for each kind of the matzah, for the Ashkenazi as well as for the Sephardic, because you speak so fast, so I couldn't follow you. Yes.
So the quantities for the Ashkenazi Matzah, you use 1.5 cups of flour. And so you can use 1 cup of all-purpose flour and 1/2 cup of another type of flour, either whole wheat or rye or buckwheat. And then you'll add 1/2 cup of water and 2 tablespoons extra of water as well. And it's warm water, and a nice pinch of salt. And so that's for the Ashkenazi matzah. And again, the recipe sheet with all of the quantities I put in the chat if you want to download it too, to have after this talk. For the Sephardic matzah, it's 2/3 cup of flour. And again, you can mix it. You can do all-purpose flour and whole wheat flour, or, you know, all-purpose flour and rye flour, you know, any sort of, the sky's the limit there. But as long as it's 2/3 cup, and you're adding 2 ounces of water, which is 1/4 cup of water, of cold water, with 2 teaspoons of oil of your choice. So it can be olive oil, vegetable oil, you know, the grapeseed oil that we spoke about, or, you know, any sort of oil. Also with a pinch of salt. And then you'll mix all of those together. And those are the quantities. But here, I'll share, I just want to make sure that everybody got the recipe sheet. So I'm going to share that again in the chat so everybody has it. Okay, and then I see how the Sephardic Matzah looks. Okay, so I'm going to take you back over with me. And I'll show you here. Hopefully you can see. Okay, yes. This is our Sephardic Matzah right here. So it's bendy, and it's thicker, and it obviously has, a lot more moisture in it. And then
we can't see you, Sara.
Oh yeah. Hi, can you see me? Can you see the if you pin the little square with the matzah, you can see them. And then you can also pin me to see me.
Ah.
So I'll bring you over. So you'll see me backlit, but you can see me. So here's our Sephardic matzah. And here, I can hold it up here. Here's our Sephardic matzah. Hi, Greg. Hi, Anna. It's so good to see you both. Here's the Sephardic matzah. We see it's very malleable, right? It's thick. But then we have our Ashkenazi challah not challah, excuse me, matzah. So on this screen, you can see it. You see it's a little darker, and it really cracks. Right? It's really like a cracker here, because it doesn't have that same moisture. And some of that comes from the observance, some of that comes from halacha, some of it comes from, personal preference over time is a major factor when we're talking about Jewish food and the different communities to which these different Jewish families have traveled. They pick up different things as they go, right? And so I do want to just disclaim before this, at the end of this talk, that even though I'm saying that one is Ashkenazi and one is Sephardic, I really mean that in the way of Jewish legalistic rulings, and not necessarily in sort of a definite way of Jewish communities and families and cultures throughout time. Because you see a mix of all of these things, depending on the individual journeys of the different Jewish people who have made matzah throughout time. So that was just a long response to your question, Anna. So thank you for that question. And it's good to see you and Greg. That's awesome. I'm so glad he's here. Cool. So I'm actually going to we've got our matzah that I put that delicious oil on, and I'm just going to put it in the oven for, again, 3 minutes. It doesn't take that long. You just want to heat up that oil and dissipate any remaining moisture in it. So I'm going to bring us back over here to end. And does anybody have any other questions? Any other concerns? Anything I can?
Yes, Sara, for the last matzah that you just put on the oven,
yes.
What is the temperature for that one?
It's at 350 degrees.
350.
350.
Sounds great.
And it's if you are cooking along with me, like I said, you can actually do this at 475. The baking time is just going to be a little shorter, right? Because the oven's a lot more hot. So it would maybe be 2 minutes in a 475 degree oven versus 3 or 4 in the 350 degree oven. So here, I'm going to just
Thank
lower
you.
this a little bit more.
Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate all of the questions. It's great. It helps me make sure that I'm including all of the information you want to know. Any other questions? Any other comments or personal experiences with matzah that you would like to share?
I just want you to know that I grew up next door to Claire Manischewitz. It was the Manischewitz family. Oh. And they and the Goodman family both had competing factories in Union, New Jersey.
Yeah. That's so fun. Yeah. And it's, I think what's interesting, I'm sorry, my camera seems to not be cooperating now. I think what's interesting about especially the Ashkenazi story, if you can call it that, of matzah, different than the Sephardic story, is that the Ashkenazi story of matzah kind of follows the 19th and 20th century immigrant experience of many Jews from Eastern Europe. And I find it so fascinating that something like matzah, which is so markedly a Jewish food, actually becomes extremely popular in America thanks to someone like Manischewitz, Dov Ber Manischewitz, who creates this factory. His family takes it and runs with it. Through various conglomerations with different companies, they end up producing, like I said, half of the matzah that's consumed in the United States. But also they later become really important in the kosherization of corporate foods, of mass-produced foods as well. So it's just kind of an interesting historical example, and it's so cool that you have that family experience with them, because they actually exerted a tremendous amount of influence on what it means to eat Jewishly now, beyond just this very kind of specifically Jewish food. And it's thanks to them that a lot of people who are not Jewish eat matzah as crackers and, for entertainment and for their own, culinary explorations. So that's so cool. Thank you for sharing that.
Well, and it was always a good employment program for rabbis.
Yes. Yeah, totally. Right. If they couldn't get a pulpit, then they could, go and make sure it be a kosher certifier in a factory. Exactly. It's truly a story of like the American Jewish experience in a way. Amazing.
Yeah, I have a comment about like matzo experience.
Yeah.
So I got this link to this workshop from my friend who's a PhD student at Minnesota. I'm at Bowling Green State University in Bowling Green, Ohio right now, but I'm from the San Francisco Bay Area. I'm living in Ohio, and my family came over during the Holocaust from like Austria-Hungary area. And they eventually ended up moving to Oakland. Like that was kind of their like end spot. And so I did not grow up Jewish like at all. Like I knew a little bit about like, our family history, but like my family was not religious whatsoever on either side, like didn't learn anything. But something that I specifically remember is my grandfather would be like lounging on the sofa, like watching TV, and he'd just have a box like of Manischewitz matzah, and he'd just like be eating it like popcorn or something, like standard. Like that was the one like Jewish experience that like I have in like my family life and culture. And it's really cool because recently, being in the pandemic and being bored and not really having much to do, like I've currently been like learning more like Jewish cooking and baking and those kinds of things. And so like I kind of have like developed my own like matzo ball soup recipe, which like I'm super interested and like excited about. And then, like I had my boyfriend try it for the first time, who like his family's from Taiwan. So it's just like a whole experience, in like two and a half generations. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you for sharing that, Robin. That's so cool. And I think what I think is so cool about that is I think and this is the reason I study this stuff and why it's so exciting personally to me, is because we can learn so much about our personal observances and personal Jewish identities by looking back over, the 5,800, 80-year history of the Jewish community. And we can actually see that, there's a lot less rigidity in a lot of ways than is sort of made to be the normative narrative of Judaism, that it has, kashrut looks a very certain way. But when we actually take a look at it, we see that kashrut is a very interpretive body. It's this thing that changes and morphs and is a sort of living organism over thousands of years. And so I think in that way, especially as like a modern young Jewish woman like you, like to me, it opens up this whole possibility where I can actually create an individual gastronomic expression of my own Judaism. The food becomes the way that I'm expressing it. And then, you know, turning again to the history, it's the way that so many Jewish communities, crypto-Jewish communities, Sephardic communities across time and space in different conditions of wealth or, you know, poverty or extreme places have been able to stay connected to that identity over time. So I love that. I'm very inspired by that too. That was my, you know, small sermon about why studying our food is so important. But yeah.
Sara, may I sing for you a Sephardic song?
Yes, please.
Because you are doing Sephardic Matzah, so I would like really to thank you in this way, myself to you. So this song is you will recognize this song. And I'm using a dufe, which is a kind of medieval kind of tambourine, which so. Cuando el rey Nimrod al campo salía, miraba en el cielo y en la estrellería, vida luz santa en la judería que habría de nacer. Abraham vino para querido, para bendito, luz de Israel.
Muchas gracias. Wow.
De nada. Realmente me encantó tu clase, es fabulosa.
Me encantó tu canción, fue increíble. Y you're right, I love that song. It's called Avraham Avinu, Abraham our father, which is, you know, it goes back to medieval Spain, and it's just such a fabulous song. And Norma, this is amazing. I'm so honored you sang that for us. Thank you so much. What a way to, like, you know, close out this amazing workshop. Wow, amazing. Where did you get that drum, by the way? I'm going to ask you, and I'm going to pull out the matzah that I have on the oven.
Well, actually, I'm a professor here at the University of Southern Indiana in Evansville. And I'm doing research on Jewish studies, and particularly I'm working with the Jewish community of, wow, I love this.
Yes, so this is our, I don't know, but this is our matzah that we painted with that honey, and we just kind of see it like all nice and crackly in there. And this is something that you can do with these matzo. It would be delicious in this matzo. You can just brush them before you cook them. You can incorporate it in the dough. It's just kind of a nice way to riff a little bit in culinary terms. But anyway, please continue, Norma.
Oh, well, so well, and I'm doing research with the Moroccan community in northern Morocco, in Tetuan, basically, and also in Shawen. And I traveled very frequent to Spain, and I bought this tambourine in the northern Spain of Galicia, in the area of Galicia. And I have a collection now of tambourines, but this is my favorite one. It's very special. And I give also educational concerts. I have been presented in Mexico, in some places here in the United States also. So I really love to cook, and I really love to sing, because Sephardic tradition is like that. You cook and you sing.
Cooking and singing, exactly. I have so many questions to ask you, Norma, and I'm happy to stay after and chat. But I just want to take a moment to thank you and to thank everyone for being here for this hour and a half cooking demo. It was just such a pleasure to talk with you all about matzah and hear that amazing song. I'm so overwhelmed. And Michelle, I just want to check in to see if there are any other announcements before we go.
No, and I hope my internet is not great, but that was really wonderful. It was really great seeing the matzah, and it was a fantastic conclusion with the song. And I forgot to thank Jewish Studies as well at the beginning. So also Jewish Studies, who co-sponsored this event. And I think it turned out great, and the bread looks amazing. So thank you. And thanks to everyone for participating.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. And just a reminder, like, if you want, I'll put my email in the chat, and you can feel free to send me pictures of your matzot. And I wish you a very Chag Sameach, a happy holiday, and have fun experimenting, because that's what the holiday is all about.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.